Hi, everyone. It's Susanna Jarrett here, and we are releasing a special short bonus episode today. One of our favorite parts about doing this podcast is that we receive so many wonderful, thoughtful responses from you, our listeners. And we recently received a response in regards to a statement we had made about IQ testing and avoiding IQ testing your homeschool students. We received this response from a homeschool mom who is just an incredible person with an incredible story. And we really felt like we needed to share both her response and her story with you all. So she was generous enough with her time to join us and share her story. And that is the treat that we have for you today.
So in the second episode of this season, it's an episode called Debunking Learning Science Myths. If you haven't listened to it, then why haven't you? Go back and listen to it now. I was pretty opinionated about avoiding IQ tests. I think, my general take was that they can sort of pigeonhole a kid in a way that's not helpful or may change the way a kid thinks about himself or herself. So we had a really, really interesting response from a listener who disagrees, which is awesome. And we wanted to bring her on. So you're going to hear from Kim about, some ways in which an IQ test can actually be helpful. So Kim, please tell us your story.
Hi, thank you so much for having me and letting me share with your listeners about this. So we have 8 children. We have a large family. 7 children were our initial group. And then later in life, we adopted a little guy from foster care, and he came to us with a lot of special needs. He was considered medically complex. He has a tracheostomy, a G-tube, and is non-speaking due to an airway anomaly that prevents the use of his vocal cords. He has cerebral palsy and an undiagnosed genetic disorder. And at one point, we did go ahead and have some intellectual IQ testing or cognitive testing done. Just as part of our journey, it just felt like it was the right time, but it was a hard decision to make. And so I think that's where I reached out to you just to share that process of making that decision.
Mm-hmm. So you made this decision because it was going to give you access to certain services.
Correct. So he's currently 11. I'll just add that. And he had, prior to COVID, he had so many respiratory problems and so many hospitalizations that I kept thinking, as I was homeschooling him, I kept thinking that if we just had a sustained long period of time at home, we could see the progress academically that I wasn't seeing. And so at that time, he was early elementary during those years and struggling to learn to read and with, a number of other things. And so, and again, he's non-speaking. So, learning to read was a challenge. You can't sound out words when you're non-speaking. And so we kind of went through COVID, and I got that really big block of time that I had always coveted. Like if I just could do school every day and we not have doctor's appointments and not have hospitalizations because he was ill, then we would get on top of the academic work. And we had to be honest with ourselves that when we got to the end of COVID, we had that obviously through COVID. We got that time. All his doctor's appointments went online and by Zoom. And then he had no hospitalizations for like 18 months, which was pretty much the first time in his life he had experienced that long period of health. And he just did not make the progress that I had always thought we were going to make this progress if we could just get this quality time.
Oh, and Kim, that story, I've heard that so often. You're sort of like, if I just had this one perfect situation, we could make great progress. And then you realize that's not actually going to happen.
Right. And he had had a lot of foreshadowing, I guess I would say, from his medical team of what we could expect intellectually. And we kind of just pushed that all aside and just interacted with him, like we did with our other kids, gave him just a buffet of learning opportunities and, and just set up a really rich literature-based program for him. And you're right, I didn't see that. I finally got the time to implement all that, and I didn't see that progress. And so his neurologist had suggested cognitive testing as young as like 5. And we just kept postponing it and felt like it wasn't, we just wanted to give him time because he had experienced so many health problems. And coming to us through foster care, he had experienced some social challenges as well. And so we just felt like he needed a lot of time for healing. But once we got on the other side of COVID, we were like, okay, we need to figure this out. And we also, on the other side of COVID, really had seen our health services change in terms of our in-home support for caring for him. Right. So he's a kiddo that cannot really be left unsupervised 24/7 due to his airway. I don't know, the general population with your listeners, if they understand a tracheostomy, but when you have a tracheostomy tube, it can become blocked. And so you need someone who's trained to support him, present at all times. And for a long time, that meant that person couldn't even sleep. We had to have a nurse awake all the time. Post-COVID, kind of things shifted for our in-home care, and it was going to look best for us to go with a different kind of program or services. And that was a very lengthy process to get in place. And a couple of the case managers, as we were walking through that, said, well, if we had, these testing scores, it would be easier because it's just sort of a black and white label, as you say, and as you criticize, and I understand that, but it's, it just gives people when they're review these, this is a 30-page document we would write about him to substantiate the reason for him having this care. And people are looking for certain things when they review that, when it goes through review board at the state level as to whether he's going to get services or not.
So just to clarify, so this wasn't even at this point, this wasn't primarily about educational services. This was just basic life sustaining services that you couldn't access without the IQ test.
Exactly. And could we have accessed them without the IQ test? Probably. Would it have been bumped back for more substantiation? Probably.
Gotcha. Yeah. Right. And there you go. Okay. There's no such thing as a blanket, do this, don't do this. When you're working with a real life human being whose needs, not only all kids have different needs, but each kid, the needs change over time. So you've got to have the flexibility to say, okay, I didn't necessarily want to do this, but clearly it's time to go get that IQ test.
Yes. And it was interesting what we found when we did do the IQ testing, in case another parent is timid, because I was timid about that. I'd heard so much negative about getting that label on a kiddo. Sure. But what we found, we went through the local university, and what we found was that they were just amazing with particularly him being non-speaking. So he uses an iPad to communicate, and they had me sit in on the testing. They did part through Zoom so he could be comfortable in his own home, because in talking with me, I said, I think you're going to see you're going to see what I see if he can still be in his own home. Right. And so they did like a 2-hour block with him in his own home. Then they brought him in to the office. They let me sit in with him. The tester encouraged me to advocate for him if I felt like his communication skills were preventing her from understanding what his responses were. And then through that whole process, what happened was he scored the highest on his language subtests.
Oh, how interesting.
Yes, which I contribute 100% to the fact that he'd already been immersed for, 8 years in this literature-rich homeschool program. Yeah. And so I think what we have found is that a lot of of his medical professionals are very surprised at the IQ test results being as low as they were, because his language and his social skills are his highest scores. He can kind of, I don't want to say bluff his way through like really brief interviews or really short doctor appointments, because he's so engaging, and he just, he loves being with people. He loves to talk, which is interesting for a non-speaking child. And, you know, he's just a little chatterbox on his iPad. And so I think that a lot of times his case manager or his doctors don't see what I was seeing on a daily basis of, you know, I mean, just for example, I have an 11-year-old currently who cannot give me 5 forks if I ask him for 5 forks. We're still working on that numeracy.
I had one of those.
And so, you know, it's, I think it was very helpful for the way the testing happened, and with so much parental input, and then also for them to be able to see what I'm seeing on a daily basis and just describe that easily in a report that I can hand over to the professionals who need that documentation.
This is such a great reminder to all parents. You should always be cautious when you're planning on making a big step that is going to label your child, but you shouldn't be frightened of it.
Right.
And I love how helpful they were. And I just would like to remind all of our listeners, there is a pervasive suspicion of institutions in the homeschool community, and it's often reinforced by sort of horror stories. And I don't doubt that people have bad experiences with educational institutions, with social institutions, but we have also heard, I would say, far more positive stories of these people are here to help. You know, you don't tend to go into a community college or, you know, a social work organization because you hate people and want to inconvenience them. You tend to do it out of a real sense of calling. And it sounds like that's what you experienced.
It was what I experienced. And I think that's so important to share, because in our situation, the people who really needed the help that we were trying to achieve were my husband and I, because we were in a marathon with this little guy and we need some respite. We need, 10 or 15 hours a week where we can step aside and take a nap or take a little break. And so, I really want, or I hope our story shares that, it's okay as a parent to say, I'm going to let my child have this test because our whole family needs the support that will come as a result of this test, or I as a parent need, the support that can come, because it can feel a little like you're on an island as a homeschool mom, and especially a homeschool mom of a special needs child. So definitely want to encourage any parents that if they're needing the support, that they not be scared or timid to do what it takes to get that support.
And that is just such a wonderful conclusion to your story, Kim. Susanna, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say thank you so much, Kim, for sharing your story with us. I had the same feeling that it's just an example of someone fiercely advocating for their child. And even when that goes against their concept, their preconceived notion of no IQ testing, but just fiercely advocating for your child through all of those concepts, setting them aside to get the accommodations that they needed. And I think that your story is such a great example of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Well-Trained Mind podcast. You can find Susan at facebook.com/susan.wise.bauer and Susanna on Instagram at hopintohomeschool. Our engineering and mixing is done by AJ Falari at ajfalari.online. This podcast is produced by Well-Trained Mind Press, and our supervising producer is Chris Bauer. If you enjoyed the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have questions, responses, or ideas for future episodes, email us at podcast@welltrainedmind.com. We'll be back next week, so stay tuned. Hi, it's Susanna and Jarrett. As we look to finish recording season 3 of the Well-Trained Mind podcast, we want to do another question and answers episode. Last season, we so enjoyed receiving questions from you all. So if you have a question for me or for Susan Wise Bauer, send it to podcast@welltrainedmind.com. That's podcast@welltrainedmind.com.